Joining me now is Dr. Courtney G. Howard, emergency physician in Yellowknife and vice president of CAPE, which is the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Courtney.
Oh, my pleasure, Jared.
So maybe we can just begin by talking about how great it is that Ottawa has committed to phasing out coal and dirty fuel emitting fuels by 2030. Can you tell us a little bit about your efforts to make that happen?
Yes, definitely. I think that we've been really lucky to be met with a federal government with a commitment to evidence-based decision making, and particularly, having some ministers with real expertise in the social determinants of health, like Jane Philpott, and a real interest in connecting the boxes between health and the environment, like Catherine McKenna. I have to give a lot of credit for the coal phase out to a lot of different people. It's momentum that started in Ontario with the Ontario coal phase out. And there was a huge coalition of health and environmental groups there who really got that done, which, as you know, was I think the single largest greenhouse gas emissions reduction measure in North America, phasing out those coal plants. And that really created a model showing us how, if you combine the arguments around air pollution, as you know, coal plants produce a lot of air pollution, and that has measurable effects in terms of increasing asthma exacerbations, COPD exacerbations, admissions for all of those. And every time you get admitted to a hospital for, a health issue, that costs money. There's lost productivity, and so the air pollution arguments that were made in Ontario, and this also has to do with some of the work the Canadian Medical Association did around the cost of air pollution nationally, started to help us figure out how to build the case for coal plant phase out using health numbers, both in terms of the actual morbidity and mortality and the costs, economic costs associated with that. So that model was really successful in Ontario. CAPE was part of that, as were many other groups. We then went on to really replicate that in Alberta with the commitment that Alberta now has to to an Albertan coal phase out. And I just want to really flag that Dr. Joe Vipond, an emergency physician in Calgary, was really CAPE's lead on the Alberta coal phase out, and really also the medical lead on the Canadian accelerated coal phase out. Joe is healthily obsessed with coal. He could tell you any stat you want to know, and has volunteered countless hours to this effort, and actually for that was just awarded the Canadian College of Family Physicians Environmental Health Award for his leadership on this. Yeah, and he deserves it. And so what happened there was, again, a coalition of environmental groups and health groups working together. Pembina Institute was really instrumental. David Suzuki Foundation also, and I think CAPE as the medical lead, with Joe leading the way, and the rest of us supporting him. And just that ability to produce evidence-based multidisciplinary reports, and then to get them into the public space with the professionalism that the big environmental groups have essentially shown us how to do it. We're both, Joe and I are emerge docs. They don't teach you how to do this stuff at medical school. So we've really had a crash course in advocacy from colleagues in other disciplines that I think has upped our game and upped CAPE's game. And the work has been good enough from an academic standpoint that it's extremely defensible, and that has led to broad participation from the Canadian Public Health Association, other provincial health associations, Canadian Medical Association also. So essentially, once the Alberta coal phase out was announced, the initiative to work towards that, Joe rested for approximately a month and a half before phoning me up and saying, "Hey, how about we start pressuring for an accelerated Canadian coal phase out?" Like, it was over Christmas. He said, Courtney, we need to talk." I was like, "Okay." And so really, the push started there, and at that point, we knew the players in the space, and we were used to working together, and made very similar arguments, just with a different target, using the targeting the federal government as opposed to provincial governments. And I think it was the right time. It was around, COP21 had just happened. The federal government had made big, commitments, and I think, legitimately does want to try to do Canada's fair share in terms of decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. And the coal phase out, given that there's real time health benefits to it that are demonstrable in terms of, everything from Canadian kids just not having to use their puffer as often to reduce costs to the healthcare system. It was a good target, and I think it lined up with a lot of different sort of intentions in various communities, and I think that's why it was accomplished.
So just sort of everything lining up perfectly, sort of for the possibility for that to happen. Do you think it's fast enough to have that target of 2030, to have the other fossil fuels at least partly continuing on? Is that fast enough? Are you optimistic that we're going to continue to ramp up efforts as Canada turns a corner?
Well, I think that that question, is it fast enough, can't really be answered now because we don't have a good cumulative summary of what everything's adding up to. Trevor Hancock, who, as you know, is a leading thinker in the space, who I think actually you're going to interview, he just keeps making the point that we haven't added it all up. So, Canada's target, we're still working with a quite weak federal target that was set under the Conservatives, and it's not really consistent with where we need to get to as a world. I think you probably know that the Lancet 2015 Climate Change and Health Report said that based on current trajectories, we're going to be hitting about 4 degrees Celsius at least of surface temperature warming globally by 2100. And, they're doubtful, the Lancet Commission was doubtful that that was consistent with the global organized civilization. So, business as usual is not good enough. We know that people's targets under Paris, if they're met, will only get us to 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming, which also isn't good enough. Our Canadian target isn't good enough to get us to the below 2 degrees Celsius or below 1.5 degrees Celsius to do our part to getting us below that. So, the coal phase out will certainly help us get to, meet the weak targets that were set under the Harper administration. But, it won't be until we've added up what are our emissions from the different pipelines that have been approved, from the different shale gas projects that have been approved, before we can really say, okay, well, this is our budget and we're going to stay within it.
Do you think that for
Sorry, that was a bit long-winded.
No, that's all right. Editing is there for a reason. For a lot of people, climate change and other environmental concerns are problems of the future. We're talking about 2100, and a lot of people have a hard time grasping things that are sort of abstract like that. Why do you think it is that health is so exceptional and in such a powerful lens to get people to be connected to what their own personal stake is in climate change?
Health is one of the main concerns of Canadians. We know that from many different opinion surveys. And, you just have to go to, a coffee date with a friend, or catch up with your family at Christmas to know that people's health is, always a main topic of conversation. So it's something that's on the tip of the tongue of every Canadian, pretty much every day. And so that is a lot more relatable than looking at carbon dioxide graphs. What is carbon dioxide? If we remember our basic chemistry, it's what we breathe out. It's what plants use for photosynthesis. But, how does that relate to our life? That's pretty tough to figure out. Whereas if you look at things like, air pollution, that increasing people's respiratory illness, major heat stress events. They can have huge effects, quite high mortality amongst the elderly and vulnerable populations like the homeless. If you look, like decreased safety of ice travel, as we're experiencing up here in the Northwest Territories where I live, food security challenges, in terms of traditional foods for Aboriginal populations, as well as just, the anticipation of further sketchy crop yields due to unexpected and extreme weather. I think health is a rallying point for people. I think food is a real rallying point for people. I came to this work partly after working for 6 months on a malnutrition project in the Horn of Africa, and watching children die from malnutrition is awful. And given that malnutrition is one of the major forecast problems to do with climate change, I think that is something that people can really connect with. Just everything from increasing food prices, because there was a bad year for broccoli this year in California because of their previous drought, to seeing flattened crops in the prairies after an unexpected hailstorm. Those are very relatable. Also, there's always the scare factor of different vector-borne disease, the sort of itchy, scratchy things that people don't like to think about. Lyme disease moving across Canada already. We know that schistosomiasis, malaria in other parts of the world are becoming problems, unpredictable things that we haven't yet forecast. We're going to have animals that are changing territories. It's going to increase the potential for human to animal transmission of different viruses or other maladies. So I think these are things that people can visualize. I think that they have a real impact on us. I think that we can imagine the impact that they can have on our kids. And given that our kids are, our children's health is one of most people's main motivators, I think that health, when you compare that to CO2 levels, it really has the potential to bring people onto the same page and give us the incentive we need to move forward to real solutions.
As a physician for environmental advocacy and focusing on these issues, as someone who has dedicated their life to caring for the health of their society and their community, and lots of other physicians are joining you. There's an enormous groundswell, or there has been an enormous groundswell so far, and continues to be, of doctors, taking up that call for climate action. What drew you as a physician and personally to focus your time and energy on climate and environment?
Well, so I actually started reading about climate change very randomly as part of a more or less, I am a nerd and I don't know anything about medicine, broad reading endeavor that I started after residency. I'd had my, nose in a cubicle for a couple of decades, and I'd forgotten everything I ever knew about geography, politics, anything. So I just started reading random books. And one of the ones that I picked up on my way to a locum in Inuvik had to do with the environment in the oil sands. And so I read it sitting beside the Mackenzie River, which, as you may know, is downstream from the oil sands. And it just I didn't even know that climate change was such an imminent threat. So I did what nerdy people do. I did a lit review on climate change. And then I did a lit review on happiness, because the lit review on climate change depressed me so badly. So I ended up, actually writing a blog for the David Suzuki Foundation on that. And shortly after that, I went to Djibouti, where they actually weren't releasing enough stats on rainfall and heat and that type of thing for us to really be able to know whether the apparent, the goats in the countryside and the camels all look terrible. Apparently malnutrition was really a feature there, like in the animals as well as in the people. The malnutrition emergency in the people actually had more to do with really increased food prices internationally during the 2008 food price spike, because Djibouti really can't grow any of its own food, so it's dependent on imported food, and that food all went up. And so given that the people in Djibouti don't have a ton of money, that just meant that they couldn't buy enough to eat. And that's why Doctors Without Borders set up the malnutrition emergency program there. And, I had come from a place where I had seen one child die in my entire medical life in Canada before going there. And all of a sudden, little babies were dying, at least weekly. And that is a profoundly humbling experience as a human and as a physician. And there was just one day where we were in the middle of a gastrointestinal illness outbreak, and I think it was about the fourth child who died within that week. And those stats are actually quite good for malnutrition emergency. I got there after the peak. So, people who have worked in other places would hear those stats and say that that's not actually very severe. But, given that my previous experience hadn't included that, it felt very severe to me.
So you had the implications of the data and the future forecast, but you also at the same time had that face-to-face personal connection to electrify that.
Yeah, the moms of these babies really made an impression on me. They were so brave and they worked so hard and so incredibly vulnerable. Most of them were displaced people who didn't have any papers. They weren't even proper refugees because they didn't have the documentation to support that. They were just people who were not in their own country, who did not speak any of the languages of power. They did not have the tools of power, and they were just trying to do their best by their kids. And after one of these babies died, the mom thanked me for my care. And I can't think of a more humbling experience than, as a clinician, to be thanked by the mother of the child who just died under your care. It is a drop through the crust of the earth in humility type of experience. And I just had this one day of rage that this was even happening. And I just said to myself, when I get back to Canada, I'm going to do everything I can to prevent this. Because by then it was pretty clear to me that, not speaking the language there, not being part of the culture, that wasn't the place where I was going to be the most effective. By then I'd figured out that the place where I would be most effective for system change would be at home. And so the task I set myself was, when I get home, I will do everything I can to prevent this. And I didn't know what that looked like at the time. But I then moved to Yellowknife, and, people say that they still maybe feel like climate change is a problem of the future. You don't feel like that up here at all. There's daily stories of things changing. Inuvik, where I first came to the north, is already 2 to 3 degrees. It's actually about 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was, in about the 1940s. And the winter temperatures are up to 7-ish degrees warmer. So, their landscape is changing. That's all frozen. All the permafrost is melting. I actually live on permafrost here in Yellowknife. My house is more or less a houseboat on permafrost, and I could write a book about what that entails in terms of replacing your sewage tank once it starts melting a hole in your front yard, in terms of trying to slide down the lake into Great Slave Lake. These are real effects. And so,
so where you live, people don't have the privilege of denying or ignoring the climate change.
There's no such thing. I haven't met a climate denier since I moved north. I mean, it would be like saying the sun is not shining on a day when the sun is shining. The diagnosis of climate change is so obvious that it's just not a thing to deny it.
Is that sort of like a big part of the problem we face, where we have, for the critical mass of the silent majority or the general public, there's that, on the one hand, it's so depressing to come face to face with the evidence and the implications, but on the other hand, it's so easy and convenient to close your eyes?
Yeah, I think that the mental health impacts of the diagnosis of climate change have been really underaddressed, and I don't think we've really developed the insight we need to into the effect that that's had on our action plan. There is evidence showing that there is profound mental health effects due to the rapidly changing landscape. Ashley Kinsella-Willex has done really good work in northern Labrador with the Inuit populations there. There's some evidence out of Australia that contemplating climate change really causes feelings of anxiety in kids. I've thought a lot about this because I couldn't figure out why, as doctors, we weren't doing more. If the Lancet says it's the biggest climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century, and then the World Health Organization comes out and says that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century. And then you look at the curriculum of Canadian medical schools, and it's still not in most of them. It's not in the CME plan for most residency programs. It's not in most training programs. And so, where is that disconnect? If diabetes was the biggest threat, we have a gazillion training things on diabetes. And I think it's because A, it depressed us, and B, we didn't know what the action items were associated with that. And so I think that we're getting past that. The Lancet's 2015 Second Commission on Climate Change and Health was really solutions oriented, and it has pointed us towards I think what we need to do, and a big part of what it contributed was a really multidisciplinary analysis. So, there were urban planners, there were economists, we had the ability suddenly to put the whole picture together and then work backwards from that to figure out what that meant for physicians. So, in collaboration, they decided that putting carbon pricing on was really a number one priority. And so the Lancet was then able to say, they actually said it was the number one maneuver that we could do to get a handle on the climate change situation in a time-effective manner. And that statement, allowed people like me to bring that towards, the Canadian Medical Association and ask for their support. So, for instance, the Canadian Medical Association now has it as policy to promote the health benefits of carbon pricing, which, are sort of carried out via greenhouse gas reductions and also via reduced air pollution and asthma exacerbations and COPD exacerbations, if you can imagine, decreased fossil fuels being burnt. So the Lancet's multidisciplinary efforts have really supported that. The other big places where we can help out have to do with sustainable urban transport, active transport, healthy urban planning. And the urban planners have been doing this for years. My medical school roommate was actually my best friend, Melissa Johnson, who was going through urban planning at the time. And one of her thesis advisors was Bill Reese, who was the guy who came up with the ecological footprint, the carbon footprint analysis. He was a prof at UBC, and another person at the urban planning school was Larry Frank, who first basically calculated or looked at how body mass index interacts with how neighborhoods are planned. And so all of this work was going on at UBC while I was there, but none of it was talked about in the medical school. And so over the course of dinners, it was becoming clear to me with my roommate Melissa that we were kind of missing the boat partially in the medical school. And so that is a place where a lot of action has since been taken. This is a huge issue now at population health and public health conferences. You'll see tons of presentations around active transport and bike lanes and what those effects are in health. And that's a place where doctors can really have a big impact. Eric Notebout, who's a physician in Montreal, has collaborated with public health physicians and some other docs, and essentially showed up at every single planning meeting to do with bike lanes, transit, and that type of thing in the city of Montreal. Yeah, and their advocacy has really been key to the revamp in Montreal's cycling network. There's other docs who've done the same thing in other parts of Canada. So, we're working on the healthy energy. We're working on the healthy urban design. I think probably the next place for physicians in Canada to really exert some energy, which is sort of one of the other places where there's health co-benefits to decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, has to do with nutrition. So many people are probably familiar with the documentary Cowspiracy, which talks about, basically the water use, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with eating meat products. And, there's data to back that up. There's been some good studies that do show that, basically the lower the amount of meat products in your diet, the lower your footprint, and actually the more health benefits there are in terms of decreased risk of some cancers and cardiovascular disease. So, that's a place where doctors haven't really gotten involved. Health hasn't done a lot at the intersection of healthy diets and sustainability. It's kind of an opportunity right now because Health Canada is redoing the the Canada Food Guide this year. So I think that as you know, just in the next couple of months and in the next couple of years, that's a place where we're going to be seeing more energy, because that's certainly a question and a comment that I'm getting a lot these days.
The last time we spoke was after you gave a presentation at the Global Health Conference here in Saskatchewan. I remember you spoke that I think you said that the logical reaction to the data we have on climate is to end up in the fetal position and very depressed. I definitely related to that myself. What recommendations would you give to what our Prime Minister calls everyday Canadians, not just on what they can do in terms of, choosing to bicycle, choosing to eat less meat, but how can they do, what sort of self-care regimens have you found to be effective for overcoming that dire nature of the problem?
Well, I think, first of all, I look at this as somewhere on, when you see a patient in the emergency department, you never really know where they're at on the curative versus palliative care spectrum when you first meet them. Mm-hmm. And when we look at this situation, I think there's still quite a lot of uncertainty about where we are on that spectrum. We know we're somewhere there, but we don't know where. And I think the important thing to remember is that both curative and palliative care are incredibly useful things to pursue and are both gifts to the next generation. So I think that, if you look at, if you want to make an analogy between palliative care and adaptation, adaptation to climate change, we know we're going to have to deal with some of the effects of climate change. So if you think about, what you need to have a good day on any given Tuesday in the year 2050, you need clean water, you need food to eat, you need shelter, you need to feel safe. You need to, I think about this as someone who's worked in, low resource medical settings. You need to have access to stable medical facilities with a good supply of pharmaceuticals and tools. So those are the things I think about when I think about adaptation. And those are practical things, how do we, that's just working on food issues. That's keeping our water clean, which involves asking some pointed questions around, I've been looking a lot into the emerging evidence base around fracking. And, there's a lot of red flags there. So that may mean standing up and just pointing out the emerging evidence and saying, look, is this really what we want to do? Because water is going to be a huge issue for us. So, there's the palliative, the how are we going to live a good day in 2050 stuff there's tons of work to be done there. And there's the curative activities. And I think with regards to that, like with regards to decreasing greenhouse gas emissions right now, I do like to focus on the maneuvers that have health co-benefits, because then you see a benefit right now, so let's get rid of those coal plants. Let's just have kids breathing easier in those neighborhoods. Let's get people out of their cars. Let's get them onto their bikes, because you know what, then they'll be healthier, they'll feel better. And, we won't be having to spend as much time doing chronic disease counseling in our primary practice offices. Let's have people eat the healthiest diet that they possibly can, because again, they'll feel better right away. I really like focusing on those things that are, have immediate real-time benefits. And I think it's important, we were kind of, for a long time, my whole growing up, sort of told, this is about you and your personal choices. And if you're not making good personal choices, you're kind of a bad person. And I think what is clear is that one of the most important personal choices that we need to make right now is to work for systemic change. Because right now, you essentially can't live a low carbon enough life within our current structure to satisfy what needs to happen. So that means we need to change our structure to make it easier to live a low carbon life. And some places are already doing that. You go to Vancouver right now and they have a mostly low carbon electrical grid. They've got electrical charging stations quite frequently sort of dispersed throughout the communities where you can charge an electric car. The electricity is actually cheap enough that you can heat with it. So you can live in a low carbon way in Vancouver in actually a pretty easy way. And so I think it's about envisioning those types of places and moving towards them. And what I've really realized is that action feels better than anxiety. So in terms of self-care, plugging into the system, taking a step out of your house, out of your worried space in front of the blue screen of your computer, feels good, because it puts you in touch with other humans. You start to see what other people are contributing. You realize you're not alone. You realize solutions are being found, and it's actually incredibly mood lifting. Other things that I think help are to not try to add that activity to your plate if you can without taking something else off. The people I've seen who are able to really contribute the most and feel the best about what they've been doing without burning out have often removed something from their plate. So in the case of physicians, are heading into semi-retirement and have sort of made this a thoughtful way of transitioning into retirement. So they've decreased their clinical hours as they increase their work in the community for climate health goals. If you can do that kind of a thing. I came back from maternity leave at 0.5 instead of at full time in order to give myself time to do it. So self-care has to do with, setting yourself sort of realistic overall time budgets. Other things are all that evidence-based happiness research that I looked up when I first did it. So, getting exercise yourself, making sure that you're sleeping well. I think good sleep hygiene is pretty important. So getting rid of your screen before bed, a good 15 minutes to an hour before bed, taking that time instead to connect with your loved ones and really talk to them and ask them how their day is. Trying really hard to put away your screens when you're with your kids so that when you're with them, you're present with them. You're really able to be in that moment with those wonderful little bundles of joy and, experience the positive and, let's be honest, sometimes frustrating emotions that come with working with them, but that are part of living life.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I really think, for a long time, I think we were really stymied in this place of, bad things are happening. And that it was kind of as though the world had walked into the emergency department, had a chest x-ray taken, and been told they had a terrible diagnosis. And then the doctor left the room without telling them what the treatment was. Mm-hmm. And I think we're finally at a place where we know what the treatments are. And the miracle is that we actually have the technology we need to be able to make the transition to the low carbon world we need at speed right now. New additional technological developments will help us to get there, but there's been several analyses done that show that we can actually get there for really reasonable economic costs. And in fact, there's been many analyses done that show that the economics of the whole thing come out in favor of the low carbon transition, because every single time there's a massive flood and there's big insurance claims, it's incredibly expensive. So, it's possible. What are the chances of us reaching a moment in time for humanity where we maybe still have time to kind of save the next generation the worst of the effects of climate change, and we actually happen to have come up with the tools that we need to do that right at that moment? I mean, it's an incredibly exciting moment in time, and I think it's incredible that health is really the thing that we will be able to use to get us all on the same page to move forward. And as a health professional, I just think it's an incredible privilege to be able to be in that position right now.
Absolutely. Is air travel an elephant in the room when it comes to all that? Is that a special challenge to overcome? Do we need to? There was not long ago a report from the States that scientists basically said we need to put a hard, pull the emergency brakes on air travel in general. Do you find that to be a hard pill for people to swallow?
Air travel is a tough one. That's probably the one I struggle with the most personally. We live far away. We live far from our families. You can drive out of here, and we do drive once a year, but it takes about, 5 days to get to Vancouver, which is where I'm from. It is tough. I personally, everybody comes to a different place on this. I don't go to conferences anymore unless I'm speaking or if I have a lot of kind of hobnobbing to do that I think will be useful for systems change. We don't take hot vacations anymore. We do go down to Vancouver to see our grandparents in the winter. It's still a carbon burden. I try to combine it with speaking engagements, but I personally don't feel good anymore about getting on an airplane for pleasure travel.
Yeah.
That is just where I've come on. for it. I
Hmm.
think everybody will make their own decision, but yes, I think that you know, that is the place where our technological solutions are the weakest. I think that we will have to rethink some of the ways that we live.
Definitely. You seem to be maybe more immune to this than anyone I've spoken with ever, but is there another problem where we face, like, and Canada as a nation until very recently was guilty of this, but do people and nations have this attitude where, like, why should I change? Why should I sacrifice when they're not sacrificing, when China and India aren't sacrificing, or when Bob down the road is driving his Hummer, why should I buy a smart car? Have you personally found that to be a challenge? And do you have any thoughts on how we can address that national mentality or international mentality more broadly?
Well, I think that, for one, there's a lot of misinformation around that. China has made bigger investments in clean technology than anyone else in the world in
Mm-hmm.
the last couple of years by
Yeah,
orders of magnitude. They've committed to
definitely.
phasing out all of their coal plants around Beijing in the next couple of years. They basically, if they don't clean up their air pollution, they're going to have probably pretty significant civil unrest on their hands. And so they have a lot of reasons to get their greenhouse gas emissions down. They also have a lot of people living within 1 meter of sea level rise.
Mm-hmm.
And they also have a lot of scientists and engineers in positions of power. So these are people who look at the numbers and believe the numbers and act on the science. China is making huge inroads. India has started a major renewable energy program. We seem to have an attitude that we expect everybody to follow the same development path that we followed. But if you look at, for instance, what happened with cell phones, they just skipped landlines in a lot of countries. When I went to
Yeah.
Tanzania when I was a medical student, I was very surprised to know that my guide, climbing Kilimanjaro, had a cell phone because I had just gotten one about 2 months earlier. Um, and so I think that that attitude of other people aren't doing anything is like, in fact, erroneous for the most part. And
Mm-hmm.
not to be too that attitude never won anything. That the leadership and doing our part is what helped Canada win the First and the Second World War. That's what helped us become major positive contributors to things like the Montreal Protocol. We know in our hearts, I think, what is good behavior, and I think that narrative, has been probably fueled by special interests to some extent, and it's not serving us. I think that on a personal level, uh, it may be helpful as doctors, especially as a merge doc, when a patient comes in, you own that patient until you find a solution. And so I haven't really felt like I should hand this problem over to other people or not do my part, because I feel like I kind of own it right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that part doesn't bother me. That's not true. We've been struggling with the decision as to whether or not to have a third child. And, there's lots of different factors playing into that decision. Sometimes I feel like I shouldn't have another child because I'll be over reproducing. And other times I think, to heck with it, everybody else, is getting on planes
Yeah.
to go places. So, it does, it does play into my decision making. And for the record, like we've decided that I'm personally going to take greenhouse gas emissions out of my decision making for having a third kid, because to me,
Mm-hmm.
it's one step too far, but that's where I've come
Mm-hmm.
to it. And I know lots of families who haven't had a third child for that reason. And so, I think everybody has their own place where, and where they just need to be comfortable. But I think the idea of, doing our part, and when we look at these little people, we have 2 kids, and every day we try to brush their teeth, and every single time we try to brush their teeth, it is a pain in the butt. And speaking with other parents, speaking with our dentists, this is a common thing, right? But this is something we're doing for our kids every single day for their future health. And I think that when I think about that, it doesn't make any sense to me to put that effort into brushing my kids' teeth and not put effort into making sure that they have food to eat with those teeth that I'm brushing so hard, you
Yeah,
know?
absolutely.
And I think, and really, like, those are the timelines we're talking about. We're not talking about somebody else's kids. We're talking about the ones who are alive right now. You know, we're talking about
Hmm.
2050 right now. We may already be at 2 degrees Celsius if we don't get our act in gear.
Yeah. A
Um,
lot of people think it's about like, oh, my children's children, when in fact it's no, it's your children, if not you yourself, that are
yeah, I
be
mean, we're
dealing with that.
already seeing, I mean, if you just look at the headlines these days, you know, big flood here, big fire here. You know, we had a wildfire up here 2 years ago that lasted pretty much all summer. It surrounded the community. Our air quality was terrible the whole summer. People couldn't go outside. You know, this is now. And really
Hmm.
where we're at is just how bad it's going to get. And are we going to be able to keep it to a level where, you know, we can still live in a societal structure close to what we have now? You know, that's what we're fighting for. We're
Hmm.
fighting for, you know, uh, the organization that we currently enjoy, and the comforts that we currently enjoy.
In the past, when we've had those sorts of challenges, in the past, when we've had things that we're doing that are bad for us, whether that's asbestos in the walls or cigarettes as you know, cheap and available everywhere and socially acceptable everywhere, we have divested. We've taken our money out of that as community and as a nation. What do we have to do to divest from fossil fuels in a way that protects our health, like we did when we put those sanctions on asbestos and cigarettes?
You know, that's a good question, and I think it's just important to add that we need to protect the people who will be affected by the transition. You know, so what we're aiming for is a just low carbon transition where we not only divest but also reinvest in things and help people along in the transition. So there's a concept that's fueling the divestment movement right now, called the carbon bubble, and basically what it is that a group of researchers out of the Carbon Tracker Institute in about 2011 published a paper that talked about how much fossil fuel we can still afford to burn in order to not send us over 2 degrees Celsius of warming
Hmm.
on a global scale. And what they discovered is that we probably need to leave at least 80% of economic fossil fuel reserves in the ground. And so economic fossil fuel reserves are the ones that are already on the books of the world's national and fossil fuel companies. So they're kind of the ones that are part of their work plan. They say, you know, in 2020, I'm going to take that coal out of the ground and sell it over here. And, you know, they can make projections of profits based on that. And they lend weight to their stock market value. And so if you think about leaving, you know, 80% of those in the ground, that could have profound implications for the stock market value of a lot of, you know, fossil fuel companies and companies that have to do with fossil fuels. And that's led some pretty heavyweights in the financial world to kind of put up a red flag and say, "Whoa, this is a problem." Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of Canada, now head of the Bank of England, has really said, "Look, there's a risk that these can be stranded assets, and we need to start examining different. We need to start really examining every company for their climate risk, for what risks exist for that company as we transition to a lower carbon world, which, you know, is really a transition that's already in process." And so after that report came out, it started what's been called the divestment movement, which started at a lot of universities across Canada and the US and has spread worldwide, with students basically asking their universities to take their endowment fund money out of fossil fuels, partly because, you know, there's this potential financial risk where, you know, if those fossil fuels have to stay in the ground, you know, the universities could use a lot of money. And also because now it's been laid pretty bare what the bottom line is. We can't sort of tell ourselves, well, it's okay if we take this stuff out because, you know, there's sort of an unknown amount of CO2 that we can afford to add to the atmosphere, and maybe this bit won't make too much difference. We know what our budget is. It's like knowing how much money you have to spend, and we unfortunately don't have a lot of money to spend.
So
And
and yeah, if my math is right, then those corporations have 5 times the maximum budget that we have. Is that right?
yeah,
If
at
80
least
if
some
it,
reserves would say even less, and that's 2011 analysis. So,
so
yeah,
so
about that.
it'd be like writing a budget for yourself where you're going to spend. So if an average, the average person is doing their monthly budget, the point we're at is like saying, okay, well, we're set to spend 5 times more than we can possibly spend for this month. No problem. Let's go. Is that
Yeah,
is that a
yeah, pretty much. And so
wow?
it's a pretty clear argument, and there's ethical implications, there's economic implications. So, and we're starting to see this argument work. So just in February, Université de Laval became the first university in Canada to announce that they would divest from fossil fuels. There's progress being made, really active campaigns at University of British Columbia, McGill, universities have had staff vote on whether or not to divest. And actually there's been some stock market indices now that have tracked, fossil free funds versus the fossil containing funds back to at least 2010, and showed that in most cases, actually, the fossil free funds have slightly outperformed the fossil containing indices. And the twinned economic and ethical arguments have led to a divestment movement within the health community that was really started by the British Medical Association, which first voted to divest. And then the Royal Australasian College of Physicians and Surgeons voted to divest. And just right after that, we had, after a series of motions at the Canadian Medical Association in the spring, I guess it was of 2015, in the summer of 2015, the Canadian Medical Association voted to divest, and also to ask MD Financial, which is they're basically a subsidiary of the CMA that acts as an investment group for physicians. Many physicians invest their retirement savings via MD Financial. So MD Financial was asked to create a fossil-free fund for physicians to invest in if they wanted to. And so they did. And that actually allowed the CMA to transfer its organizational funds into the fossil-free fund. So the CMA has completed its divestment from fossil fuels. MD Financial has a fossil-free fund. They have both a bond and an equity fund that are live and accepting investments from physicians. MD Financial has actually gone so far as to get certified carbon neutral. Of all of the people that I have talked to about this, MD Financial really got the argument probably the fastest, and I think it's because they're so numbers oriented. They basically looked at the carbon bubble, and once they were satisfied that it was all legit because it was totally novel information to them, they understood the ramifications very quickly and moved quickly. And I think it's just, an example of, when you really look at the bottom lines of climate change, it's clear that real action needs to be taken, and there are action items that we can take. It's not, we don't have to sit there stymied. We can move. And recognizing that, therefore, if you take your money out of something, there's opportunity to then put it into something and to create jobs for people. Here in Yellowknife, I was part of a solar energy collective, and there were 13 families who all decided to put solar panels up, and we kept a solar contractor operating all summer, him and, I think 2 of his workers. So, there's huge money to be made in the transition to a low carbon world. We have electrical grids to build, we have high speed trains to build, we have all sorts of energy efficient buildings to build, an entire energetic transition. And I think we just need to be conscious that it will be disruptive, and it's a disruption that's occurring at the same time as, the automation of a lot of jobs.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of reasons why we need to be looking at things like a guaranteed basic income to basically create a safe net for people as all of these transitions are taking place, so that people can be less afraid and therefore more able to to participate in transitions.
Yeah.
And also to welcome, the inevitable displacement of people that we're probably going to see as climate change progresses. The refugee situation that we have now is not likely to decrease. We need to expect a lot of people to be moving out of places with, not quite enough water, not enough food, or conflict ensuing from those. Is definitely forecast. And I think that the more we can, make people here in Canada feel secure, the more welcome we will be able to make others, and the more welcome transitions will be.
It's definitely easier to live more conscientiously when you're not constantly struggling for survival, to be sure.
Yeah.
What role do you think that a carbon tax plays in that process?
Well, the basic idea is polluter pay. So the idea is to tax the behavior that you don't want. So what BC, for instance, has done with its carbon tax is that they instituted a carbon tax, and then they actually, I think, legislated that it ended up having to be revenue neutral for them. So they gave that money back in the form of an income tax break. And most of the studies have shown that it worked. The prices needs to, as the Lancet said, be predictable and go up in a stepwise fashion, because then it basically gives the heads up for people as they're, moving from purchase to purchase, what will be to their advantage. If you know that the carbon price is going to go up by 10 degrees every year for the next, 5 years, you can say to yourself, you can do the math and realize that, okay, well, maybe it is worth paying a little more for the hybrid car, because I can anticipate that the carbon tax is going to be, X amount in that year. And therefore, if I actually look at how much I will be paying for fuel, it's worth my while. I'll save myself money if I make, a purchase of a more sort of low carbon investment now, and that can be applied to heating. It can be applied to anything. So the idea is actually not for people to make more money with the carbon tax, or for governments to make more money. It's for us to just, it's sort of a forcing factor for us to make the choices that we need to make in order to, decrease greenhouse gas emissions as much as we need to. And there's been some modeling studies that look at like what the health outcomes associated with carbon pricing would be. And they generally show that via if you burn less fossil fuels, you'll have decreased air pollution, and, you can expect improvements in respiratory outcomes and decreased costs associated with those. And so there is a health argument to be made, both in terms of sort of the proximal health factors as well as more long-term health factors.
I think, do you think that the government has done a good job of explaining and communicating the need for the carbon tax and the benefits of the carbon tax to the Canadian population?
Well, it's interesting. I learned about carbon taxation from a late Yellowknifer, unfortunately, named Doug Ritchie, who was an economist and also was on the board of my health authority. And he got wind that I talked about climate change and health, was interested in it, and approached me to give presentations with him about carbon taxation. Because his problem had been that, he, as an economist, didn't have any training in basic sciences, and didn't feel like he was a good person to make the case. And so what we actually did was I would give my climate change and health spiel, and I would get to the point pretty much where the audience looked like they wanted to jump off a cliff. And I would, because that was early, the action items were less clear to me at that point. So I don't think my presentations were as tuned up as they maybe are now. And then I would say, here's Doug. And Doug would then talk about carbon pricing. And when you put it in context, it seems like a very reasonable thing to do. And actually kind of a relief, because you're like, okay, well, here's the solution. Here's a probably effective treatment. Yes, let's do that. And so, trying to sell a carbon tax is probably one of the least sexy things anyone in the history of the universe has had to do. I think that, there's lots of different approaches. There's the cap and trade and, straight up carbon tax. I think, when you read broadly, BC's approach with the revenue neutral approach seems to float well with people on a lot of different sides of the spectrum. And, it's been praised worldwide. And I think, that to me makes a lot of sense. Other approaches can make sense too. But I think the government has done a reasonable job of it, and I appreciate the fact that they've stuck to their guns on it.
Hmm. It is nice to see more and more Canada taking that role of leadership and not necessarily um, just not necessarily like kowtowing to other actors. How did you feel when Britain left the European Union or voted to leave the European Union, and the American people voted a climate denier to president this last year, in terms of what implications those would have?
We don't live in the US, and so we're only sort of vicariously seeing that. I think there is so much progress to be made at the local level. And I think that there's a lot of progress to be made not talking about climate change. If you just talk about air pollution, and it
Mm,
achieves the same goals. And so I think that what we'll see, when on the macro scale we've got, climate denying physicians, I think we'll see a lot of people choosing to be like, okay, well, I'm going to talk to my council about bike lanes, and I'm going to talk to them, and say, look, I really hate it when in front of my kid's school there's a bunch of people idling. It's not good for the kids. My kid coughs when they walk past that. It's not good for their health. Let's, make the drop off zone 2 blocks away, make everybody walk a certain distance. They'll get some exercise, they'll get some fresh air, they'll get to know their community. I think that we'll just start to see a lot more of those productive, small scale local actions, and those are what change lives.
mm-hmm.
That's what will change the fabric of our society. So they may become more difficult in the absence of, you know sort of the support that can be had when a national structure is really pushing things. But I think there's so much momentum now, and the technological solutions are becoming so much easier and so much cheaper. I mean, solar is dropping, it's like plummeting in price. Tesla has its gigafactory for battery storage, which is changing the game there. We've got these solar tiles. Wind is plummeting in price also. We have, the Internet of Things is allowing us to really maximize in energy efficiency within houses. The number of solutions we've got is just incredible, and most of those choices don't have anything to do, yeah, with the federal government. So I think progress will continue. The speed of progress may decrease, but I have not succumbed to despair on that front. I don't see many other people in the space doing so either.
Well, I think you've given us a lot of ways we can come out of that fetal position, Courtney. I think that's a heck of an optimistic place to end on. Um,
Well, that's good. Well, just in case anybody's there, in my first couple presentations, I would give cookies out at that part of the presentation. And so, like, if you're really stuck, like short-term doctor prescription for a couple of
yeah,
cookies,
a
like
couple of cookies, get the
get
blood
get out
sugar
there,
up,
give me a
and
call. Yeah, exactly. Get enough blood sugar to get to a phone, send me an email, and I'll help you the rest of the way.
yeah, or maybe some cute pet videos on YouTube, something to just a little eye bleach, something to raise the
Yeah, why
spirits.
not? Everybody has days where you need that, and do your deep breathing. I've actually added tactical breathing to my presentations, which is a fancy sort of paramedical term for taking big abdominal breaths and centering yourself. Mindfulness is important about this. Going about it thoughtfully is important. Being compassionate, and really talking about, how do we support everybody in this transition, no matter where they're working, where they're living, what age they are. I think if we approach this with a mixture of courage and compassion, we're going to do well.
It was such a pleasure to speak with you for so long, Courtney. What a
Oh, well, my pleasure to talk to you too.